I'm speaking to Lori Wallach from Public Citizen. Lori, how are you doing this afternoon?
I am okay.
Excellent.
So we're up to our ears in fast track and TPP here in Washington.
It is completely and entirely scary. What I'd like you to do for me is I'd like you to tell me why it is, number one, that the TPP is so destructive to the American worker, and secondly, why is it that we're not hearing more about the TPP in the mainstream media?
Well, to start out about what it is, it's heartbreaking because when President Obama was a candidate, he said he was going to replace the old Nixon-era fast-track process for negotiating and approving trade agreements. And he said he was going to replace the old job-killing U.S. trade agreement model. And if he'd done that, everyone would be united with him fighting for a good trade agreement now. Instead, with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which they started negotiating in 2009, the administration has basically doubled down on the failed old model of job-killing trade agreements. And now the president's even trying to get the old Nixon-era fast track to railroad the TPP through Congress. Here's what we know.
Well, before we get into the substance, I want to ask you something. Isn't it true that every president since Nixon, in fact, for all trade agreements, have always had the fast-track authority?
That is not true. In fact, fast track has only been allowed by the U.S. Congress for 5 of the last 21 years. The only presidents who've been able to extract fast track from Congress were Ronald Reagan in 1988 and George W. Bush in 2002. It's an anomalous process. A lot of members of Congress hate it because whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, what it means is you're basically sidelined from the formative aspects of trade agreements. You do a blank check. So this current fast track that's up in Congress now, if Congress were to pass that for 6 years, whomever is president can unilaterally pick any country to launch trade negotiations with. Congress gets no say over the right country, potential good export partner, wrong human rights abuses. Just the president starts by himself, herself, either way.
No.
Then the president gets to set the contents. The president gets to sign and enter into the damn agreement before Congress ever votes on the contents. And all of that is allowed whether or not the president meets Congress's negotiating objectives. And then whether or not the president meets Congress's objectives for what's supposed to be in the agreement, the White House gets the right to unilaterally write an implementing bill that can rewrite wide swaths of U.S. law. It does not go through committee markup. So you can stick anything into this bill, and that gets a guaranteed vote plus the approval of the agreement in 90 days after the signing of the agreement and its submission. No amendments allowed. It is a veritable legislative luge run.
Why would a presumably progressive president, first of all, negotiate a treaty like the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well as request the authority?
I think for almost any president, the idea of that much unilateral power on some level has to be appealing because Democrat or Republican alike, the notion of basically being able to have wide swaths of Congress's constitutional trade authority, but also legislation writing authority delegated to you so you don't have to mess with them, but you can do what you want, has got to have some kind of an appeal. But it's remarkably anti-democratic. And under this fast-track bill, the text of these big agreements would be kept secret until 30 days after they were concluded. The president's been saying, ooh, we let the deal go out 60 days before I sign it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the way that works is 90 days before the president can sign it, when the deal is finished and it's been initialed and the text is done, 90 days before the official all the flags, fancy pants signing ceremony, there's notice given to Congress it's done and locked. 30 days after that, when it's too late to do a dang thing about what might be wrong in the agreement, is finally when the American public gets to see it. That's baloney.
Now, enumerate for our audience exactly what's wrong with this treaty or this proposed treaty.
So it's so secret we don't know all of it. There are 30 chapters. The administration's listed the names of them. Looking on the Trade Representative's website, we can see only 6 of the 30 chapters have to do with trade. A couple of them have leaked out. So here's what we know. Number 1, the TPP would make it easier to offshore American jobs because thanks to a WikiLeaks, we know it includes those NAFTA investor protections that basically eliminate the risks normally associated with moving American jobs to low-wage countries. These investment rules, well, the Cato Institute, the Free Trade Libertarian Cato Institute, calls them a subsidy on offshoring. It's why we lost so many jobs under NAFTA. Number 2, we know, sadly, the administration chose to recycle the labor and environmental standards that were in George W. Bush's last 4 trade agreements. Now, that may have been the best that you could get out of a Republican president, but the unions, the environmental groups, who are 201 lockstep opposed to TPP and fast-track, are infuriated at how weak those standards are, and worse, the Government Accountability Office just a couple months ago came out with a study after doing an investigation on the ground that empirically showed those provisions hadn't made a whit of difference to conditions on the ground in the countries where they apply. The third thing we know is that the TPP includes those provisions that were in the World Trade Organization that ban the application of Buy America, Buy Local, policies that basically say when the government's buying goods and services, they should give a preference to the local, to the American. And that reinvests our tax dollars to create jobs and to strengthen businesses here versus offshoring our tax dollars with our jobs. That would be banned, and in fact, the ban's so broad, it would give equal access to U.S. tax dollar-funded projects, not just to every company in a TPP country, but any company that happens to be invested there. So all those tiny state-owned enterprises in Vietnam will get a waiver by America. Third thing we know is that would require us to import food that doesn't meet our U.S. safety standards. We don't know all the details about that chapter. We just know that that particular provision is in there, and that's a really worrying issue, particularly because there are really serious issues with imported seafood from TPP countries like Vietnam and Malaysia. We know that it has the rules that could roll back financial services, because that's another chapter that's leaked, and that, we've seen Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren, and Barney Frank, the Dodd-Frank co-author, all raising those concerns. And then finally, because it leaked, we know the TPP includes a chapter on copyrights that could roll back internet freedom, and the other half of that chapter on patents could raise medicine prices. So you've got the unusual situation of, say, AARP, Doctors Without Borders, upset about TPP because of the medicine price issues. You've got Consumers Union on the warpath about the food issues. You've got the small businesses on the warpath against TPP over the ban on Buy American. You've got all the consumer and financial security groups and seniors groups on the warpath about messing up the financial regulation system again, et cetera, et cetera. That's the non-trade stuff. And then the trade part, of course, besides the offshoring, and everyone should, hold on to your hats, the administration's admitted the TPP, the template for it on the trade part, was the administration's 2012 U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. That was literally the text they submitted for the trade parts of the agreement. And that agreement, in 3 years, has resulted in the doubling of our trade deficit.
Exactly.
It was sold as more exports, more jobs. Our goods exports have declined 7%. Our trade deficit has doubled. So let's plug those numbers in. It's a job loser.
Now let me ask you, what is the solution?
We need both to replace the fast-track trade authority with a more inclusive, transparent process for negotiation and consideration of agreements. And there are a lot of examples of what that would look like. The one that's in formal legal language is the 2009 Trade Reform, Accountability, Development, and Employment Act, the Trade Act.
Now,
Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And that lays out both what a good trade authority would look like, that would get trade agreements passed at the end, but would make sure it's the right countries and the right contents, and that any special rules of consideration are earned by meeting the objectives that Congress would set with public input.
No.
And then as far as what's the right kind of agreement, the Trade Act lays that out too. Section 4 of the Trade Act lays out exactly what should be in a trade agreement that would get us all the benefits of expanded trade without repeating all the damaging mistakes of our past trade agreements, which, TPP is like a carbon copy of PLUS.
Isn't it true that there is no way we can have a fair trade, or rather we could actually have trade agreements that actually work, given that most countries in the world pay less than America does?
So the answer is an agreement like the TPP that involves a country like Vietnam, where wages are less than 60 cents an hour, is going to push down American wages, and even more dramatically so because the TPP hasn't even meaningful, effective labor standards that over the long term would try to help the Vietnamese workers raise their wages. But even if those labor standards were strong, U.S. wages would go down if we're having an agreement with a country with such rock-bottom wages. There are countries with whom the U.S. could have a trade agreement that wouldn't have that effect. So, for instance, if the TPP were really intended to boost U.S. exports, create jobs, and raise wages, we'd be having a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan that got rid of tariffs, let us compete, we'd win, and had disciplines against currency cheating, because you don't want Japan to just reduce the value of the yen, of its currency, and effectively get rid of the tariff cuts that it just agreed to. But an agreement like that in a country that has vaguely similar wage levels, Japan's are a little lower than ours, but not dramatically so, in a place where there are high enough wages also that you create consumer demand for U.S. export. The president's very fond of saying 95% of the world's population lives outside of the U.S., and we better have these trade agreements to trade with them. The problem is, while 95% of the population may live outside of the United States, under our current trade agreement rules, they're making too little income to buy the things they make to sell to us, much less to buy the things we want to export to them.
Right. So I think, in effect, you agreed with what I just said. Under the current conditions, trade deals are never going to be in the favor of the United States worker.
Unless it's with a country that has a more equal wage level.
And there are very few countries that have that actually have that.
No, that's right. An agreement like the TPP, both as a matter of economic theory and as a matter of the history of what similar past agreements have done, will lower U.S. wages, full stop. Will increase income inequality, full stop. And by the way, when you have trade liberalization between a wealthier country and a less developed country, it is actually standard macroeconomic theory that you will reduce wages in the richer country. And the way it's described is you redistribute income upward. Which is to say it goes to capital, not the worker, because you're basically going to shift investment to a poorer country, making it profitable for capital, but bad for labor.
That is the most important statement that you've just made right there, and that is what people need to understand, but in a manner that is more easily understood by the average American citizen. Because what you just said, while important and while true, it isn't something that is easily transferred to the psyche of the average American citizen.
Well, the way that it can be made very clear is the TPP is going to make it easier for big corporations to offshore our jobs, and it's going to push down our wages by giving special privileges for companies that leave and pitting us Americans against workers in Vietnam making 60 cents an hour. We can see practically what that's going to mean, and sadly, that the workers will lose and capital will win is also what is traditional economic trade theory.
Absolutely.
That's how you would say it in a more accessible.
Now, tell me, where can people find more information about the TPP so that they can inform themselves as to why this is so bad for the country as a whole?
Yep. I would recommend two particular websites. One is tradewatch.org. That's our website. You can learn both about TPP and about fasttrack, and there are lots of action opportunities. But that website also has an enormous amount of accessible data. So under a standing Freedom of Information Act order we had to litigate to get fulfilled, we have the entire U.S. Department of Labor Trade Adjustment Assistance database. That is the list of all 3 million jobs that the United States government has certified as trade casualties since NAFTA. And we have the full set of data, and we hired someone to program it so it's searchable, unlike on the government website, which is a bunch of PDFs. So you can basically put in your zip code, and you can get every certified plant sorted by what sector it was in, what town it was in, what congressional district it was in. You can do congressional districts and get all the plants, and you can literally look at the wreckage that the past trade agreements have caused, and it's an undercount because this program only applies if either the company or the workers apply for it. So it's not like it's the full snapshot, but it's a really useful picture of very practically, here are 3 million Americans who lost their jobs to imports or offshore.
And
that's on there. And the second site is a site called exposethetpp.org. And that one is less, has less of the heavy databases, etc. It's much more an accessible campaigners website.
Right. Well, excellent.
exposethetpp.org. My name is Lori Wallach, and I'm the Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch.
Thank you very much, Lori, for spending this time with me.